Konnichiwa. Welcome to another intriguing tale from the annals of history. Today, we journey back to the fascinating life of
Fyodor Dostoevsky was a Russian novelist, short story writer, essayist, and journalist. He was considered one of the greatest novelists in all of world literature, and known for works that explore the human condition and grapple with philosophical and religious themes. In 1845, the writer Fyodor Dostoevsky, then 24, shook the Russian literary world with the publication of his first novel, Poor Folk. He became the toast of St. Petersburg society. But something about his early fame seemed empty to him. He drifted into the fringes of left-wing politics, attending meetings of various socialist and radical groups. One of these groups centered on the charismatic Mikhail Petrashevsky. 3 years later, in 1848, revolution broke out all across Europe. Inspired by what was happening in the West, Russian radical groups like Petrashevsky's talked of following suit. But agents of Tsar Nicholas I had infiltrated many of these groups, and reports were written about the wild things being discussed at Petrashevsky's house, including talk of inciting peasant revolts. Dostoevsky was fervent about freeing the serfs, and on April 23, 1849, he and 23 other members of the Petrashevsky group were arrested. After 8 months of languishing in jail, the prisoners were awakened one cold morning and told that today they would finally hear their sentences. A few months' exile was the usual punishment for their crime. Soon they thought their ordeal would be over. They were bundled into carriages and driven through the icy streets of St. Petersburg. Emerging from the carriages into Semyonovsky Square, they were greeted by a priest. Behind him they could see rows of soldiers, and behind the soldiers, thousands of spectators. They were led toward a scaffold covered in black cloth at the center of the square. In front of the scaffold were 3 posts, and to the side was a line of carts laden with coffins. Dostoevsky could not believe what he saw. "It's not possible that they mean to execute us," he whispered to his neighbor. They were marched to the scaffold and placed in 2 lines. It was an unbelievably cold day, and the prisoners were wearing the light clothes they'd been arrested in back in April. A drum roll sounded. An officer came forward to read their sentences. "All of the accused are guilty as charged of intending to overthrow the national order and are therefore condemned to death before a firing squad." The prisoners were too stunned to speak. As the officer read out the individual charges and sentences, Dostoevsky found himself staring at the golden spire of a nearby church and at the sunlight bouncing off it. The gleams of light disappeared as a cloud passed overhead, and the thought occurred to him that he was about to pass into darkness just as quickly and forever. Suddenly he had another thought. If I do not die, if I am not killed, my life will suddenly seem endless, a whole eternity, each minute a century. I will take account of everything that passes. I will not waste a second of life again. The prisoners were given hooded shirts. The priest came forward to read them their last rites and hear their confessions. They said goodbye to one another. The first 3 to be shot were tied to the posts, and the hoods were pulled over their faces. Dostoevsky stood in the front, in the next group to go. The soldiers raised their rifles, took aim, and suddenly a carriage came galloping into the square. A man got out with an envelope. At the last second, the Tsar had commuted their death sentences. Later that morning, Dostoevsky was told his new sentence, 4 years hard labor in Siberia, to be followed by a stint in the army. Barely affected, he wrote that day to his brother, "When I look back at the past and think of all the time I squandered in error and idleness, then my heart bleeds. Life is a gift. Every minute could have been an eternity of happiness. If youth only knew, now my life will change. Now I will be reborn." A few days later, 10-pound shackles were put on Dostoevsky's arms and legs. They would stay there for the length of his prison term, and he was carted off to Siberia. For the next 4 years, he endured the most abysmal prison conditions. Granted no writing privileges, he wrote novels in his head, memorized them. Finally, in 1857, still serving the army period of his sentence, he was allowed to start publishing his work. Where before he would torture himself over a page, spend half a day idling it away in thought, now he wrote and wrote. Friends would see him walking the streets of St. Petersburg, mumbling bits of dialogue to himself, lost in his characters and plots. His new motto was, try to get as much done as possible in the shortest time. Some pitied Dostoevsky his time in prison. That made him angry. He was grateful for the experience and felt no bitterness. But for that December day in 1849, he felt he would have wasted his life. Right up until his death in 1881, he continued writing at a frantic pace, churning out novel after novel, Crime and Punishment, The Possessed, The Brothers Karamazov, as if each one were his last. We all have freedom. It can feel overwhelming with endless choices. We often waste time due to a lack of urgency. True urgency, often brought on by external pressures, makes us feel more alive and focused. Soldiers fight best when they have no choice but to fight, like when backed into a corner with no escape. Necessity is the real driver of human behavior. We only truly change and feel passionate urgency when forced to by circumstances.